commentary in Dr. Edinger's book, Transformation of the God Image. And I'm particularly talking about apocalyptic dreams because Dr. Edinger's point is that these days everyone has apocalyptic dreams, but at the time of the book of Revelation, John of Patmos, who was talking about his revelation, didn't know that. And so Revelation turns out to be the activation of the collective unconscious, according to Dr. Edinger and Dr. Jung. And so I'm going to read for you a modern apocalyptic dream. Before I do that, I just mention that on my way back home this morning, I was listening to Walter Isaacson's biography of Leonardo da Vinci, and he was talking about an apocalyptic dream that Leonardo da Vinci had. It seems that Leonardo, when he was a young man in the area around da Vinci, went down into a cave, and there he found a huge fossil of a whale, believe it or not, a fossilized whale. And that encounter with that whale constellated in Leonardo many apocalyptic dreams and visions throughout his lifetime. So I just thought that was an interesting synchronicity that I would hear that today. Okay, so Miles can hear me. That's wonderful. And Stephanie, welcome. Nice to have you here. Okay, so I'm going to start by reading this vivid dream by one of Dr. Edinger's analysands. It's called The Paradise Bomb Shelter. And so here's the dream. We were in a room which was somewhere between being a bomb shelter and a fortified inner city of an ancient holy town, such as Acre or Jerusalem. The walls were foursquare, and between the wall and the room, or the building, there was a corridor of air, something like an overgrown, encircling apartment house air shaft, a buffer region, a no man's land. And in this room, privileged company sat, crouching, waiting until we hear the terrible explosion of the bomb descending on the outer world. It happens, and in the din and the shaking take over, then they recede. We have been told that so long as we stay inside the walls, and so long as we don't open the huge bronze doors, everything within the shelter will remain free from radiation and fallout, and there will be no death by contamination. A group of 5 of us, feeling our hermetically sealed room as itself fated, and being filled with curiosity to see the ruined outer world, we run to the doors anyway and proceed to pull them open. That is, 4 of them do. I lose my nerve at the end and fall back to watch from a distance while the others proceed. Finally, with difficulty and great creaking noise, the great bronze doors open, and as they do, they let in light, burning, blinding, bitter tasting, acrid smelling, deafening, suffocating white light, which is radiation. It doesn't take the 4 long to decide they all have all seen all they need to, and soon they are trying to close the doors again. And that is when I step out of my corner and stand in the middle of the corridor, waiting for their return. And as soon as the first one returns, I catch her and embrace her warmly. She looks at me, startled but moved, and says, "Don't you realize that now, through touching me, you too are contaminated?" I nod my head, yes, I do know. But that was the point. I wanted to share her contamination. I wanted to indicate love, sympathy, admiration, and a desire to be akin to all the consequences of the new human condition. Then I ask her, "What did you see outside?" And she answers, "Only a lot of broken glass." Next, we go about preparing for the deaths we feel sure will result from the exposure at the gates. Initially, 2 people did die, but after that, there are no further deaths, and it is as though the death rate has slowed down to normal. It is incredible. We had expected a ceaseless parade of dying and agonized radiation-sickened citizens, but now it begins to look as if it will take a lifetime for all of us to die. Then I see a family group sitting as though for a formal portrait, and I realize we had even been given the power of reproduction and generation. So this life is like the other, only we are free from the bind of stagnation and immortality. Through growth and decay, we can change, and bomb shelters can become holy cities. That's the end of the dream. Edinger comments, "Well, I'm not going to offer my interpretation of that dream. It pretty well speaks for itself, showing you how what first appears as a destructive nuclear light turns out, on close inspection, at least when it is approached with the right conscious attitude, to be rather an image of initiation into authentic human experience, which includes, of course, mortality." Okay, so the point is that what is happening in this woman is that her self is being constellated, and her ego is being overwhelmed by the numinosum of the archetype of the God image, and so and the further point is that these sorts of apocalyptic dreams, as I mentioned last week, I had one only about 10 days ago now, are quite normal, and especially in modern people. We have them often. Maybe John of Patmos didn't know of a lot of people who had had big dreams like that and who had the ability to write them down. And so, anyway, the point about the Paradise Bomb Shelter is it's an initiation into authentic human experience, which includes mortality. The self, an instrument of the two-edged sword, symbol of logos. In my dream, I had a dream that included the bladed sun. Now, do I have that? Okay, yeah, I do. So here's a image that Dr. Edinger put out, and notice the blades in the light coming out of the God image here, and of course here's the double-edged sword here, and this is Christ of the Apocalypse in this Albert Dürer woodblock. And in my dream I had a similar God image, and it was followed by a beautiful sun woman, as I had mentioned. But anyway, the sharp-edged instruments are the instruments which divide, and the logos at that time was insufficiently conscious, so people were living a much more instinctual life at that time, and the logos came along and brought rationality into human life at that time, at least for the Jews of that time. And so the next point that Dr. Edinger was making is that every collective entity, which includes any group of individuals, has one particular collective theme. And these are, and his point is that every organization, whether it's your Cub Scout group or the United States of America, is a psychic organism, and it transcends the mere existence of individuals. We are cells in the organism, and so we all need to think about that, because that's a big issue for us these days, and what our organism is, whether it's healthy or not. The next point, which appears on page 107 of, let's see, okay, I do have that on the screen, of Transformation of the God Image, is the archetype of the chair. And this reference goes back to the vision of Ezekiel, which came along about probably 500 years before John of Patmos had his revelation dream. And in that dream, God was sitting on a mighty chair. And so it's from this archetype. Now, a lot of people don't understand that a chair can be archetypal, but even the analyst chair is an archetype. And he commented about the fact that many analysts, Jungian analysts, tend to speak ex cathedra, which he's rather critical about, because obviously if you're speaking ex cathedra like I am, which is I don't have people to interact with me verbally here, just on chat, so therefore I have to speak more or less in a lecture format here, and so I guess for the purposes of this conversation, I'm sitting on the chair, and so chairs, the chairman, that type of language refers to someone who's leading a group, I guess. And Miles says, you may have said it too, but Professor Robert Jensen, University of Texas, said apocalyptic just means the unveiling, so it does not mean disaster or destruction, I think you mean. It would be good. I haven't looked up the etymology of the word apocalypse, actually, and so that may well be. What Dr. Edinger says is it's not necessarily bad, and what he's emphasizing here is this is an experience that John of Patmos had as a dream or vision, and he was clever enough to write it down, and then people hung on to that very extensive vision for another 200 plus years before the Bible was put together, and then they stuck it in the end of the Bible. So anyway, moving along. Then he's referring to the numerical archetypes. And, and there are several numerical archetypes. One of them that comes out in Revelation is the number 7, and that's based on planets, the planets that they knew of at that time in human knowledge, and they saw those as the steps from earth to heaven. And so that could be Jacob's ladder, for example. It's a planetary ladder. And so we often see things in sevens. For example, it's associated with the initiation process. So in the case of Boy Scouting, in order to achieve the Eagle Scout level, you need 21 merit badges. And typically it takes you 3 years to accomplish that. And so it's 7 merit badges each year. And then then you are marked, okay? And from a psychological point of view, the marking is you're marked for individuation. And let's see. And but the comment that he makes here is that all archetypes are bipolar. That means congratulations and condolences. So in the case of the Boy Scouts, congratulations, you're an Eagle Scout. Condolences, you've reached maturity and you must face real life now. And so that isn't always welcome. And then he talks a bit here about the conjunctio. Let me make sure I got that on the screen for you. All right, so on page 112 he says the future is now, and Jung has understood and interpreted the image, so performing the function of bringing its meaning and its realization to fulfillment. So he's talking about the continuing incarnation of God here. And then on page 110, he tells about, he makes a reference to Revelation 8:7, and he talks about a dream he had in which there was a church shooting, and a third, it was a terrorist event, and it means it means an assault on the ego. And so one of the other issues for numbering here is 4 is considered wholeness, or the quaternity, the eternity number, and babies when they're born have latent wholeness, and then that gradually gets attacked by things in 3s, and so that's the device of 3 number. I'm taking their word for this because I'm not a psychoanalyst, and so I'm not trying to analyze anybody with respect to this. And one of the things that Dr. Edinger says that you might find controversial is on page 125 or 112 of this book, where he's talking about the sun woman and the child of the sun woman who is caught up to God. And obviously the sun woman in this case is Sophia, and she's the consort of Yahweh, if you will. And at the end of this in Revelation, the child of the sun woman is caught up to God, and it's saved from the dragon. And so it's saved for a future time. And the sun woman herself is put into the wilderness. And what Dr. Edinger says is that the child is an anticipation of Jungian psychology. Well, that may be, but that's a Jungian interpreting the child of the sun woman in Revelation as an anticipation for the future of Jungian psychology. But in any case, the child is a product of the conjunctio in the pleroma. In other words, the metaphysical God and Sophia both existing in the pleroma. And it means a joining together of the masculine and the feminine. And it means a unified image of God. And what he's saying is that Jung is bringing the realization of this myth or this vision into reality by talking about how this is a conjunctio of the masculine and feminine, and we're now seeing the feminine come out of the wilderness, which I don't know when it started for sure, but when it apparently started in the United States was when Susan B. Anthony and her colleagues started to demand the vote in the United States, and so the feminine starts to come out of the wilderness, and as we'll see near the end of this and also next week, it reaches the point where in 1950 Pope Pius XII admits Mary, the Virgin Mary, to the heavenly bedchamber. Okay, so it's now the Trinity and the Virgin Mary, so it's a quaternity that show completeness in heaven. And Dr. Jung felt that that was the most important religious event since the Reformation that had occurred. I think we could say that women are saying enough of this wilderness business, but I suspect that there's also the issue that human beings, as compared to the 17th century, let's say, when my ancestors came to the New World, the average life expectancy was 40, and so most of life at that time was taken up by child rearing, quite frankly, and there wasn't enough time for anything else. But now that we're having life expectancies that go up towards 100, then, women are obviously demanding the right to have something to do after child rearing for at the minimum, but obviously much more in terms of their rights. And what Dr. Jung is saying is that this was actually prefigured in the archetype of the apocalypse. And actually, Dr. Edinger has an entire book called The Archetype of the Apocalypse. And he also, in Ego and Archetype, talks heavily about the archetype of the apocalypse and how things are getting stirred up so that they can reform in another way, because the Christian Aeon has been driven by logos. Okay, so what these gentlemen were saying at that time is that there was not much rationality in the ancient world in 2,000 years ago and before, and what was needed was logos, a double-edged sword, splitting things up and making more rational decisions rather than instinctual decisions. And obviously, over 2,000 years now, we have a lot of slicing and dicing with that double-edged sword. But the double-edged sword represents the opposites, and there's good sides and bad sides to those slices. And so now we're in desperate need of more Eros, because the logos by itself is simply sterile, as Dr. Jung noted in paragraph 623. I'll just remind you of that. I'm sorry, paragraph 621, where he's talking about the same archetype, but in this case he's talking about Yahweh's marriage to Israel. And he says, at the bottom of Yahweh's marriage with Israel is a perfectionist intention, which excludes the kind of relatedness we know as Eros. The lack of Eros, of relationship to values, is painfully apparent in the book of Job. The paragon of all creation is not a man, but a monster. And so Dr. Edinger is alluding to that here, and also, just hold on just a second. I need to grab a book. Okay, so I'll just take a look at Civilization and Transition. This is volume 10 of the collected works, and I'm looking at an essay called Woman in Europe by Dr. Jung, which was dated 1927. I've been speaking about that in our reading group meetings, and there, I'll just quickly read to you this last paragraph of this essay, which, mind you, this is after World War I, when millions of men were killed in the trenches, and he's talking about the indirect way that women work, but in any case, he explains himself. The indirect method of woman is dangerous, for it can hopelessly compromise her aim. That is why she longs for greater consciousness, which would enable her to name her goal and give it meaning, and thus escape the blind dynamism of nature. In any other age, it would have been the prevailing religion that showed her where her ultimate goal lay. But today, religion leads back to the Middle Ages, back to that soul-destroying unrelatedness from which came all the fearful barbarities of war. Too much soul is reserved for God, too little for man, but God himself cannot flourish if man's soul is starved. The feminine psyche responds to this hunger, for it is the function of Eros to unite what Logos has sundered. The woman of today is faced with a tremendous cultural task. Perhaps it will be the dawn of a new era. And so he was prefiguring the more active role of the feminine. And I guess my point is that this psychology professor at the University of Toronto, Jordan Peterson, he is performing an important role because we have many unfathered men in the world today, not only in the United States and Canada, but throughout the world. And those young men need guidance. And so, in a sense, Jordan Peterson is providing them with the logos, but he's somehow misleading people into thinking that logos is all there is. That isn't the case. Logos leads to a dead end if that's all there is. And so the logos splits things up. So in the ancient world, where everything was pretty instinctual, logos came in with rationality and started to slice and dice things. And then we come up with, by now we have about something like 400 sects of Protestantism. And you say, really? Did God really think that there should be 400, or is only one of them right? Or, just how does that work? And so, so what's needed is the uniting now of these ideas, and not only the ideas of Christianity, but the ideas of all religions, into an amalgam, which is of Eros role, a feminine role. And of course, when I'm doing this video with you, this is a relatedness task. So this comes from my feminine side. It isn't that I don't have a masculine side. Certainly I do. And I served 23 years in the Marines, and I became a lawyer MBA, so I have a lot of logos in me, but then my psyche has been evolving in such a way that I see that relatedness is needed, and this is why I'm doing these videos now.